Welcome to Solly
Gauta
UNCUT. Hi, welcome to yet another robust Solly Gauta UNCUT discussion. Today, we've invited John Henry Steenhuisen, federal leader of the DA, to come and join us. I hope you're going to enjoy what's coming, folks. Very good, robust questions from us, and I'm sure that John is not going to disappoint.
Mr. President, in a recent interview you said, and I quote, "I would rather be seen as a weak president than split the ANC," unquote. And isn't this quote precisely why you are incapable of fighting corruption? Because when the ANC is threatened, you will always put the ANC before South Africa. Let's call out the last 48 hours for what they really are: a smokescreen. Whether it's this ridiculous attack on me or the disgustingly personal denigration of Minister Godaan and his family, or the vile abuse the EFF have meted out to journalists who have exposed them, it is a smokescreen. A smokescreen to mask the corruption of their party and the network of patronage and rent-seeking that resulted from the looting of VBS Bank. This ANC has been trying to get me to shut up for 21 years. They've never succeeded, and they never will.
And the new leader of the Democratic Alliance is? John Steenhuisen.
John, welcome to Solly Gauta UNCUT.
Thank you, Solly, and thank you to the rest of the team. It's great to be with you two today, and look forward to the engagement.
First question, right off the bat. You've just been elected as the leader of the official opposition in Parliament, the second biggest political party in the country. In our race-obsessed political landscape, I should think this is a very tough job that you're facing. What do you think?
Well, of course, leading any political organization is a tough job and comes with a variety of dynamics. I think that the race obsession exists a lot harder and a lot more entrenched in Twitter and on other forms of social media. I don't necessarily think that it is a view shared by the majority of South Africans. And certainly if one looks at the by-election results of the recent by-elections, both the first round and the second round, our support from Black South Africans has doubled and trebled in many of those instances, despite the fact that I happen to be white and the leader of the organization. I think more and more as the economy collapses, more and more people join the unemployment queue, and as opportunity dries up, I think more and more South Africans are going to be worrying less about the race of those who are driving solutions to these problems and more about who's best able to get my business up and running again, who's able to get me into a job, who's able to provide my children with a decent education so they've got a fighting chance to compete in the future. I think those are going to be the questions of our time. And certainly the local government elections, I think, are going to be fought very clearly on the economy, who has the best plan to South Africa, and who can deliver services. And I think that's what's going to matter more and more to South Africans going forward.
South Africans want a credible alternative. And each time you have a discussion about whom you're going to vote for, we know that the DA is voted for by many people from all colors and backgrounds. But there's still a tranche of South Africans who say, whom do you want us to vote for if we get the ANC out? So is the DA prepared? And again, the DA used to have a discussion about being the replacement to the ANC. But the DA can't have its cake and eat it. In other words, so something has to give for the DA to be prepared to stand a chance rather of replacing the ANC one day. Do you guys have these discussions in the DA about what must change for you to be that credible alternative?
Well, I think those discussions have been taking place over the course of the last year. Solly, I'm sure, as you know, the last election result was not a good one for the party. And I think voters across the spectrum sent the party a very clear message. We've spent the last year introspecting on an internal review report, which looked at some of the shortcomings of the party. And we've been through probably the most comprehensive and inclusive policy conference in the history of the party, where I think the DA's ideological moorings and ideological directions and what our worldview on what needs to be done were solidified, and those were then confirmed again at the Federal Congress later this year. So I think we're well on our way to providing a very clear alternative to the ANC. I think that, a lot of, in the past, I think a lot of people have been putting pressure on the DA to be an alternative ANC, whereas what South Africa needs is an alternative to the ANC. And I think that the very clear policy blue water between the DA and the ANC now, particularly on things like BBBEE, things around how we get inclusive growth, how we lift people out of poverty and into opportunity, I think give us an opportunity to be able to demonstrate that. I also think that the COVID-19 crisis has given the DA an opportunity to demonstrate to South Africa why an alternative is important. And at every step of the way, whether it was the Blue Book interministerial process that we led to look ministry by ministry what needed to be done to prepare the country for COVID-19, our smart lockdown model, our COVID-19 action plan for an incapable state, all of these were our own ideas, our own policies, our own worldview, our own plans about how we could fix things. And I think that the more that we're able to position ourselves around our own plans, not just critiquing the ANC, but saying, well, look, the ANC have messed up, but here's a plan to how we can fix South Africa. I think that's what voters are looking for. I think they're tired of parties that are shining lights down into the hole to see how deep it is. I think what South Africans are looking for are parties that are going to be able to shine a light out of the situation and show them how they're going to get from a shack into a decent home, how we're going to fix our schools, how we're going to get our economy working, how we're going to attract investment. And I think the more the DA is able to play in that space and force the ANC to engage us on our own ideas and our own frames, rather than engaging the ANC on their ideas and their frames, I think it's a far healthier debate that we're going to start to have in South Africa.
You didn't lose much of your black support last year in general elections. But the question still arises, there's a risk card being thrown at you at every chance that the opposition gets. Now, what is your position on redress, black economic empowerment? You raised it there. But secondly, you have been described, the DA has been described as being more able to implement ANC policies than ANC itself. The way you govern in the Western Cape is very interesting. What do you think there? What is your position on BEE redress?
First of all, I would dispute the fact that we implement ANC policy in the Western Cape. We don't. We have our own growth agenda, which is why the economy is growing there and unemployment is the lowest in the country and service delivery is the best. It very clearly shows there is a differentiation between policies, and that policies do matter because they impact on people's lives. In terms of BBBEE, we start from the point that we have to have a redress system in South Africa because we have a history of dispossession, both legislatively and physically. People deprived of the right to own property, people unable to pass on generational wealth. So we have a huge inequality in South Africa, and we have to address that. You can't put your head in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist. We are one of the most unequal societies in the world. But here's the thing. I think that you've got to judge any policy by not its intentions, but by its outcomes. And I think there's very few people, including in the ruling party, the governing party, who would admit that BE has been a huge success. It hasn't. There have been more black South Africans, households are 10% poorer now than they were at the beginning. There's more unemployment. And we've got 30 million South Africans who are locked in poverty. They fall under the 998 Rand per month threshold of income. There's 30 million of them in South Africa. And I think that BBBEE has led to price gouging. I think it's led to a deterrence of investment into South Africa. And I think it's created a very small elite of people who've done remarkably well out of this consensus between the ANC and big business. And they obviously have to protect that little consensus. Our policy conference and our recent elective conference have resolved that we're going to be the voice for the 30 million South Africans who don't have a seat at the table. The unions have a seat at the table, and their job is to protect the employed. They're not interested in the unemployed in South Africa. Government, big business, all have a seat at the table. People who don't have a seat at the table are those people trapped in poverty. And our view is that what government needs to do is to change its policy focus away from BBBEE and focus on using poverty as the measure for empowerment in South Africa. That way, you automatically cut out the fat cats. I mean, we don't need to give the Motsepes and the Ramaphosa's and that of the world more money. They don't need help from government. They've been empowered and, they've done very, very well. It's time now to focus policies on those 30 million South Africans who are living in poverty. And you don't need to use BBBEE because 99.7% of the 30 million people who live in poverty are Black South Africans. So if you focus your policies there, 99.7% of the beneficiaries are going to be previously disadvantaged Black South Africans, but more importantly, they're going to be the South Africans who actually need government's help. And I think we'll be able to break down this terrible insider-outsider consensus that's developed between big business and the ANC and the unions to keep people locked out of opportunity so that they can obviously eat more of the pie. And so I think that it would be a far more progressive way of doing things. We also know that the system works. A NISFA system works on this basis. The SASSA pension works on this basis. If you qualify, you fall below the threshold of 998 Rand a month, you must be the beneficiary of that particular policy. So I think that it'll be a far healthier way. It'll automatically exclude people who are already empowered and are fabulously wealthy. We don't need to be helping the people who can go and buy 5 Porsche Cayennes on one day. We need to be helping the person who has been living without a job for 6 years and is starting to lose hope. Those are the people who need our help. And I think there's a huge gap in the market for a party that can speak up and speak out for those people who currently don't have a voice on the political landscape.
John, it's very hard to disagree with a lot of what you've just said, but I want to go back to this, that since the end of apartheid, many people in South Africa have known the ANC, have gotten used to the vocabulary of governing, of leading the ANC. And because it's been 26 years, people think that's the only way to look at things. And we know that there's got to be another way to look at things. There are people who still believe, John, that were the ANC to be replaced by a party like the DA, apartheid would return, because the only South Africa they know, other than one that's governed by the ANC, is one where there was apartheid, where there was no room for Black people. So how do you say to people that there's no way that apartheid can ever return? What message do you have to those people who still go around? Because I can tell you this, I've met people who've been told by ANC ministers that if you remove us from power and the DA comes in place, the apartheid is going to come back. So you need to have a message for those people as well. Absolutely,
Solly. And I mean, it goes all the way to the top. I mean, the president in the last election said, don't vote for the Boers. If the Boers return, apartheid's coming back. Well, first of all, I mean, it's an emotive argument. And it's often difficult to fight emotive arguments with rationality. And the rationality is there for all to see. We have a constitution. There's no ways that apartheid could ever return in any form with the current constitutional guarantees, the Bill of Rights, as well as the entrenched clauses in the Constitution. So, I mean, it would be impossible, even if a party wanted to bring back apartheid, which I sincerely hope there's no party in the spectrum that wants to do that. It would legislatively and physically not be possible. But here's the thing. I think that the more that we can demonstrate that life actually gets better under our policy suite and our policy regime, the better I think it is, and the more of a lie it makes of that argument. So that is why we need to be able to, I believe, use our arenas where we govern to demonstrate to people that, why is it that the best access to basic services is in DA-run municipalities? And it's not just in the Western Cape. And I think the best example of this are 2 municipalities that lie side by side, actually in Gauteng, Midvaal and Mfuleni. I mean, they're a couple of kilometers apart. Mfuleni is a complete typification of the failed state. Poor service delivery. It's never received a clean audit. People live in absolute squalor. There's mass unemployment, huge informal settlements. Midvaal, right next door, run under the DA policy regime, it's got a growing economy. It's lifting people out of poverty. People are living with dignity, of running water, of houses, etc. That for me is a far more powerful argument to be able to use the demonstrator. It's very easy to tell people what you're going to do. I think it's a much more powerful antidote to what government and others say, to be able to demonstrate that not only is it not true, but here where we govern, just look at how people live. Now, I'm not saying that wherever the DA governs, it's a Garden of Eden. We live in a society where there's huge backlogs and huge inequality. It still exists. But are we further along the road of addressing those than any other places in South Africa? Absolutely, without a doubt. And we've got a long way to go still, but we're a lot further along the road than many other municipalities around the country and governments in the Western Cape, for instance.
A very thorny issue, emotive issue, land. Where do you stand on land policy, especially redistribution or nationalization of agricultural policy?
Well, first of all, I think that we must dispel the myth that the hunger for land is in rural areas. It's absolutely not. The hunger for land is in urban and peri-urban areas. It's a natural phenomenon the world over that people gravitate to urban areas because services are better, there's better education opportunities, better access to healthcare. So I think the real land hunger lies in the urban and peri-urban areas. And I think that what we've got to do is be honest about the fact, first of all, that we have a problem in South Africa. The patterns of land ownership are still very skewed, and we've got to redress them. We cannot deny the fact that there was legislative dispossession of land and the ability to own land, particularly by Black South Africans, dating back way to the early 1900s. The Glenn Gray Act, the Pegging Act, Group Areas Act, all of these legislatively deprived people. So I think there's got to be positive action that's taken to address that. And we believe that, rather than going down the road of expropriation without compensation, we should go for the low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit, as we sit here today, are the huge tracts of government-owned land, well-located government-owned land in cities and on the urban edge of cities, where we would be able to almost overnight develop projects. Eysterplaat, for instance, in Cape Town is a couple of kilometers from the city center. You could have a huge 30,000 unit development there where you could provide housing opportunities for huge amounts of people. That's the low-hanging fruit. You don't need to expropriate it. You don't need to go through a long, arduous court process. You could just get government to release it to either the province or the municipality and let them start doing mixed-use developments on those particular pieces of land, so we can get people housed and give them the dignity of home. I also think that there's a myth that's been created around this whole expropriation without compensation argument. It's somewhat of a red herring. There's nothing in Section 25 of the Constitution that is an impediment to land reform and even expropriation. I mean, every country in the world expropriates. It's not something that would be unique to South Africa. And there's a variety of aspects that you have to look at when looking at expropriation, the current use of the land, the historical acquisition of the land, etc. So, this notion that we need to now amend the Constitution to achieve land reform in South Africa is a red herring and a massive distraction. And we've been talking about it for 3.5 years now, and we're no closer to resolving it. Whereas that low-hanging fruit that's been hanging there in front of our face to be able to change land ownership patterns overnight would be there. The other piece of low-hanging fruit is government property and land that's already been acquired through the land reform program, where there's been no passing of title deeds over to the beneficiaries. So you've got huge tracts of land in rural areas where government's acquired farms, but you've got the beneficiaries living like serfs on the land. They don't own the land on which they work. We've been involved for the last couple of years in a court case on behalf of Mr. David Rakhatse, who was promised the land on which he's been working. He's invested a lot of money on it, and government would simply refuse to pass the title deed over to him. Luckily now, through our action in court, the government's now been compelled to honor its agreement with Mr. Rakhatse. But Mr. Rakhatse's case is repeated hundreds of thousands of times over across South Africa, whether it's RDP homes that were handed out in 96, where people still don't have title deeds, or land reform projects where the beneficiaries have never received them. That's the low-hanging fruit. Let's get the low-hanging fruit out of the way and get those land ownership patterns changed as quickly as possible without having to delay things through long court processes. This expropriation compensation is going to, I believe, be another 5 to 6 years, even if government moved at full steam, because there will be court challenges. Let's park the red herrings and let's get on with it. Another way in which we could also start to transform is deal with the backlog of land restitution claims. The current rate of land restitution claims being processed, it'll take another 36 years just to process claims that are already in the system. Let's get retired judges, retired magistrates in, and let's clear those backlogs, because those restitution claims are a huge source of pain and anger. Many South Africans have died without their restitution claim ever being resolved. Those are just 3 ways you could, almost overnight start to change things without having to amend the Constitution, without getting embroiled in big legal battles. And I think that's the way that we can start to address it. Then once we've done that, if we need to look at expropriation, let's look at expropriation. But let's get the easy wins over the trial line first, before we start to battle on the big, difficult maneuvers like expropriation without compensation.
I think maybe a lot more noise needs to be made around those issues, those alternatives that we haven't looked at first before we go the hardcore route, and maybe more noise needs to be made about it. But let's move on to COVID-19. We can blame. It's maybe politically correct to blame where we are on COVID-19, but maybe we should blame it on the nature of the restrictions. I mean, COVID-19 is a global pandemic. There's no doubt about it, and government had to do something. We can agree on whether the restrictions from lockdown level 5 in March were good, fair, or whether they just considered the political side of things, ignoring the economic side of things. So, on the whole, do you think the South African government has managed this thing well, especially with the most recent restrictions? I know that you guys are in court challenging some of the lockdowns of beaches in the Garden Road. So how would you do it differently? What do you think government should do, given that COVID-19 is a reality? People are dying of this thing, and it's hitting hard in other parts of the world. So where should we go?
Sure. Look, and I think that the first point to acknowledge is that this is not an exact science. And, it's something new. It's not something that's ever been had to deal with. And no doubt, as governments around the world grapple with COVID-19, it is a learning curve. But I believe that government started well, and then some issues started to creep in, which were very disturbing. So we supported the initial 3-week lockdown, given the fact that nobody really knew what was happening. We were the first party in Parliament to call for a snap debate on COVID-19 and what we needed to do to prepare for it. We supported the president's initial lockdown. Given the fact that lockdowns themselves will never control the spread of the virus, they're merely there to buy you time to prepare your healthcare response. And we've now had one of the hardest and longest lockdowns in the world, which have had huge economic impacts on South Africa. I mean, we've had over, I think, around about 4 million, I think that the figure sitting at now, people who've lost their jobs. We've had businesses that have closed. And we realized after week 3 that hard lockdown was never going to be a sustainable option for South Africa. It's one thing to be sitting in Denmark, with your Netflix and your nice home, and you're going off to the supermarket, fill your fridge for the week and stay at home. That's not the reality for the majority of South Africans who live hand to mouth. It's impossible to self-isolate when you're in an informal settlement or in a low-cost housing development, and people have to go out to earn a living. And we saw perhaps the best manifestation of that poor woman in week 3 who was out selling atcha because that is the only way she can provide for her family. And there she was being arrested. But what started to worry me particularly is the authoritarianism that started to creep into this. And for many government ministers, this was the power trip that they've all been looking for and waiting for. You can finally now control people, where they go, what they do, what they wear, what they eat, how they should wear their clothes, what people should be allowed to buy, etc. And I think that the genie, once it's out the bottle, and many of those ministers tasted the authoritarianism without having to have parliamentary oversight, without the usual checks and balances, I think that there's been a addiction to that now. And I think we're seeing it manifesting itself. Just this last week, we had Bheki Cele on the beach instructing officers to shut down a movie set that employs people, that helps keep the economy moving, that brings in foreign investment into South Africa. And they're in a cavalier way just shutting down because this authoritarianism is actually the dream of many of those ministers. And I think that the president, I think he started off well, and I think he's been led astray by some of these authoritarianism. That's why I'm very grateful that the BATSA case last week, the tobacco case, was very critical of government's heavy-handed approach and the like. We're at 2:30 today in court on the decision to close the beaches. Look, it's about balancing lives and livelihoods. What is the biggest killer in South Africa? The biggest killer in South Africa is poverty and unemployment, because it lies at it's the underlying cause of many of the health predispositions in South Africa. It's hunger. It underpins all of that deprivation. And so I think that there needed to be a far more of a fine balance between lives and livelihoods, given the fact that the economic damage that's been done here, I think, is going to have a long-term impact on South Africa. Malnutrition, hunger, starvation, people's health deteriorating as a result of lack of employment. That's going to be with us long after COVID-19 is a distant memory. And what also frustrates me, Solly, and I'm sorry I'm giving a long answer to a relatively short question, is that COVID's now become the scapegoat for everything that's wrong in South Africa. People forget that we were very low in the water long before COVID or Corona was anything more than a beer you had with friends on a Friday night, on a night out. And now suddenly everything's blamed on Corona, when in fact, I think it's the draconian lockdown regulations and 2 decades of policy failures that have really left us in a very, very vulnerable state.
Right.
Taking a cue from that answer, there's life during and after COVID. Many countries are grappling with stimulus packages, social relief programs. And we have seen 350 Rand for poor people in South Africa, not even scratching the bottom of the top of the surface. There's the money from the UIF has been lost. There's a lot of dissatisfaction about the way the 500 billion was expended. Now, the DA, we'd like to know what policy alternatives do you have for the country? Would you support a basic income grant? We see the ANC doesn't want to discuss it, but they mention it. But how would you help to come up with alternative solutions that will stimulate the country, the economy out of the quagmire?
Well, I think there's a number of things that need to be done. The first of all is I think government's intention on the 350 was very good, and the like. But one of the first things we proposed was right at the beginning, having seen the huge amounts of money that went missing over every time there's a big procurement in South Africa, whether it's the funeral of Nelson Mandela to an arms deal, there's always the feeding trough that gets opened. So one of the first suggestions we made was for an inspector general of COVID procurement that would have gone through and checked every COVID procurement to make sure that it was above board. And I think we could have avoided a lot of the huge amounts of wastage and price gouging and feeding at the trough that we've seen over this. And I think we would have been able to stretch that 500 billion a lot further had there been greater transparency and accountability. But we can't cry over spilt milk. It's happened. We need to move forward, and we need to get the economy moving forward. And I think the first thing that we've got to do is to focus on taking power away from the incapable state and giving more power back to the people of South Africa. How do we do that? Well, I think that we've got to break down this obsession around state-owned entities. I think that, spending the billions we are on SAA is a terrible waste of money, in the light, particularly in a country where that money has an opportunity cost of job centers, of startup capital for entrepreneurs, of being pumped into NSFAS and the like, and yet we're trying to keep a failing airline in the air. We then got to deal with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which I think are holding South Africa's investment prospectus back. First amongst these is expropriation without compensation. It's a massive deterrent to investors. Why would you build a factory here in South Africa and invest huge amounts of money if 3 years later, in the national interest, it could be expropriated without compensation? And without that security of property rights in South Africa, you're never going to get that type of investment. And there's a distinct correlation on all the figures and all the metrics around the world between solid property rights and economic prosperity. And there's an intrinsic link between property rights, infant mortality, adult lifespan, etc. Countries that have got strong property rights, people prosper and they live longer and they are more successful and there's less poverty. Then you've got to deal with the NHI. We can't afford the NHI. We've got to find an alternative way to provide universal basic healthcare. We believe we've got an excellent plan, the Sizani healthcare plan, which would provide universal access to basic healthcare for all South Africans in a far cheaper, more effective way than just nationalizing the health industry and rather partnering with the private healthcare industry rather than trying to dumb down the whole system. Then we've got to move away from these balmy policies of nationalizing the Reserve Bank. I think it causes huge jitters in those communities. And then, as I said earlier, state-owned entities. We've got to walk away from the state trying to do a whole lot of things really badly, and rather the state focus on doing the few things that it should be doing well. Should a state be running an airline? I would say no. Should a state be running an arms manufacturer? I would say no. Should the state be running a diamond mine? Absolutely not. These are all things that are far better served by the private sector, and which government, and just by doing taking one of those state-owned entities, could unleash a jobs revolution in South Africa, and that is breaking up the electricity monopoly in South Africa. You could unleash a whole greenfield industry of renewable energy, of energy supply and distribution, that I think would create a huge number of jobs just by taking the power away from the incapable state and giving that power back to the people of South Africa. And that's where it belongs. So I think if we can get those things right, and you know what? It's not rocket science. It's not like trying to put somebody on the moon. These are basic things that if we can get right in the next decade, I believe would get South Africa onto a completely new trajectory of growth and opportunity. But we seem to cling to this ideological notion that the state's got to be in charge of everything. The state's got to be directing everything. Whereas I think that there is a role for the state in the economy and in the country, but that role is to create the enabling environment and to get out of the way of business and entrepreneurs and unleash their potential to grow the economy.
What do you say to those South Africans who think that John is not really the leader of the DA? The Zille factor. What if Zille say something tomorrow that pushes the DA back onto the back foot? We have to have this discussion, John, because people do think that you have the shadow of Zille hovering above you. Are you the leader who will say, no, this is what we stand for, irrespective of what she says? And let's not talk about freedom of expression. She has the right to say all the things she says. This is not the question. The question is, are you able to stand up and say, I'm the leader and this is how it runs?
Yes, Solly, and it's happened already. I mean, I've taken a very strong line about Helen on Twitter, and I think you probably would have noticed there's been a complete change. I'm the leader of the party. I was elected with an 80% mandate, and I lead the party every day. Helen has her job and her lane, and she gets on and does that, and I think she does it rather well. And I get on and lead the party. And, I make the political decisions. I make the final calls on things, and Helen and I work very, very well together. And, a lot of people say, oh, well, why do you have her in your organization? Well, my answer to that is, why wouldn't you have her in your organization? This is somebody who's not only spoken about the capable state, she delivered it in the Western Cape. It's not somebody who's spoken about a growing economy that creates jobs. She delivered it in the Western Cape. And I think you'd be mad if you were serious about being a party of governance in the future, not to have her feet under the table. You don't necessarily want the fingers on Twitter, but certainly the feet under the table and that expertise, I think, is invaluable. And I think if there were a lot more Helen Zilles around, I don't think, in the government benches, I don't think we'd be sitting in this terrible state where, even the most basic and good intention of government just hits straight up into the brick wall of the incapable state.
What do you think about coalition politics going forward? There's local government election next year. 2 years thereafter is the national provincial elections.
We've spent the last 5 years in the school of coalition politics, and we've learned a lot of lessons, some hard lessons, but also I think some good lessons that are going to stand us in good stead in the future. Don't go into coalitions with parties that don't share your values and principles, and where you cannot govern the way in which you want to govern. The worst thing for you is to get into government and then end up, doing things like turning a blind eye to fleet tenders and the like, just to keep smaller coalition partners who don't share your values happy. Look, any DA leader who stood here and told you we were going to get 51% in the next election or the election after that, I don't think would be honest with you, and you'd probably pack up laughing. So the future is coalition politics. The goal is to bring the ANC below 50%. And once that happens, I think it starts to open up a range of possibilities. I think that I'm quite excited about that future. And that's got to be the goal, which, so I don't spend my time fighting with other smaller opposition parties. My goal is to bring the ANC below 50%. Because once that happens, I believe that it opens up a range of possibilities that will be able to, I think, open up a new chapter for South Africa going forward. And, certainly going into coalitions in future, be around a set of values and principles. The red lines will be clear about what we will not do. We will not tolerate interference in the administration, in tenders and appointments, etc. And thirdly, I think that we must set out what the goals and objectives of that are. And I think that those coalition agreements should be made public to those municipalities, or if it's a national coalition agreement, to the country. So everybody knows what your red lines are, because staying in a coalition where your values and principles are compromised on a regular basis damages your brand. And we saw this recently in Lenasia in the round of by-elections there. The mayor at the time, who was a DA mayor, turned a blind eye to some really chronic land invasions there, because one of his partners who helped him pass his budget said, if you act against those land invaders, we will not vote for your budget. And the people of Lenasia are rightly angry and feel let down by the DA, because that we were not there to protect their property rights when they needed us the most. And that anger translated itself electorally in those by-elections. So there are consequences when you don't live up to the values and principles that you espouse. And I think there's a very strong lesson in there for us about going forward, about rather go onto the opposition benches and be a damn good opposition than be in a tenuous coalition where you're living from council meeting to council meeting, and where you can't govern to the full extent of your values and principles.
Thank you very much, John Steenhuisen. It's been great to have you on board. To our viewers out there, I hope you really enjoyed this robust discussion with John Steenhuisen. And please do not stop following us on Facebook and Twitter at Solly Gauta.
Thanks for watching Solly Gauta UNCUT. Please subscribe to our channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And for notifications of new episodes, please click the bell.